Hello, everyone. My name is Makawe Taba, and I am a student at the UKZN, and I'm also a project support officer at the Center for Creative Arts, the CCA. I'd like to welcome everyone to this very important webinar. I am very, very excited actually about today's this session where our experts, Ms. Adipheli Makwanya, will be sharing her insights into issues pertaining to intellectual property and contracting and all those kind of things. I think this is a very important issue. We all are aware of the Solomon Linda debacle, and we all are aware of how that turned out. And so I think intellectual property and licensing are such a very important, it's a very important topic to have knowledge about and to know of. Before I go further, I would also just like to thank our audience. I would like to thank our sponsors and all our supporters, especially the KZNFC who made this session possible. And I would also just like to give some housekeeping rules. Please have your microphone muted if you're not speaking. And also, if you have any questions, please write them on the chat box and we will get to them at some point. Now, our expert, Ms. Adipheli Makwanya, she's an independent consultant and researcher in the cultural and creative industries. She has 17 years experience in film and television industry and also now audiovisual. She's a founder and managing director of Danda Consulting Events. The company provides management consulting services for government, SMEs, and art organizations. Services offered include fundraising, art marketing, government market research, and strategic development. Feli serves as a member of the Council of the Market Theatre Foundation, a member of the CASA's Consumer Advisory Panel, chairperson of Badamani Foundation, an NGO with a focus on health and art and culture-driven programs. She worked for the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa and the National Film and Video Foundation of South Africa from 2006 to 2018 in policy development and in research roles. So we are in very capable hands, and I would like to give this platform to you, Ms. Makwanya. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the introduction. I'm looking forward to spending the next hour with everyone, and hello to everyone who's tuning in. Let me quickly share my screen so that we can do the presentation. Okay, I am going to switch off my video for now. If that's okay, you can still hear me. Without any delay, let me just kick off with the presentation. So this is the agenda for this lunch get together. I am going to be talking about the policy context for the importance of IP within the cultural and creative industries. And then I am going to talk about IP copyright protection for audiovisual works in South Africa. And I'm going to talk about exploitation, monetization for creators. I would like to believe that most of you are content creators, and it really doesn't matter, at what level of the industry you're playing in, whether you are a tier 3, tier 4, or someone who is just curious about some of the opportunities within the industry. So with that, I'll just have a few concluding remarks. So I think it is important for us to frame this discussion by taking some time to reflect on the policy context, because it is important. It is the policy context that, that sets the kind of framework within which yourselves as content creators do your business and collaborate amongst yourselves. It is the policy context that regulates, the other players within the value chain, your distributors, your investors, and to a certain element, your audience. So let's start off from that perspective. So when we talk about the broader cultural and creative industries, I want us to come back to our sector, the audiovisual and interactive media, which is one of the cultural domains as recognized by UNESCO. And we're talking about film, we're talking about television, we're talking about photography, we're talking about video, we're talking about broadcasting. So when we talk about the audiovisual and interactive media, some people just talk about audiovisual only. So for example, if you have a look at the revised white paper on arts, culture, and heritage, which is the cultural policy for South Africa, it only refers to audiovisual. If you have a look at some of the policy documents from, the NAVF, which most of you would be familiar with, whether it be from a funder, funding, whether in terms of the funding that you tap into, whether in terms of some of the programs that they have put in place to support the sector, they also have shifted from the film and video that was used way back in the years. And of course, that is purely, that is purely on the fact that, the NAVF Act itself, National Film and Video, is still very much based on the old NAVF Act that is yet to be amended. So just something to think about, when you hear, government or any other, key players within our sector, most of them are now talking about audiovisual, and it's more broader because it also includes photography, as I indicated earlier. And one of the things to start off is around the many values that are associated with our sector. So you would know the creativity that you put into the various outputs or the various work that you are collaborating or working with other players in the sector from time to time.
I'm so sorry. Can I please quickly interrupt you? I seem to be in the way of your presentation. Can you please minimize your video by clicking the thin dash line? Then, that.
I don't know why my mouse is just not working with me. Okay, let me try that again. Is that fine?
It's fine on my end.
Yes, I've done that.
I will let you know if anything needs to happen again. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So let's continue. So the many values of the CCIs, including the audiovisual and interactive media. So I just talked about the creative side of things, which all of you are, this is your daily bread. You are consistently creating new works. And also the economic side of things, which is important for today's conversation around IP and copyright, and then the recreational value, educational value. And I think you all know this in one form or the other. And, you would have come across it in terms of, some of the broadcasters that you do business with, the type of content that they will be sourcing from you from time to time. So this all speaks to that. And of course, this is within the revised white paper that I was talking about. It's 2020. Sorry about that little typo there, 2020. So one of the key things to take away from this, obviously, is that as creators, you need to be always, cognizant of the fact that, the sector within which you operate has been recognized for their contribution to, social and economic imperatives. I'm sure all of you, when you are putting together those funding proposals for, Mzansi Golden Economy, and recently the, PESP funding that closed a few months ago, you all had to think about how do you as a content creator contribute to social cohesion, How do you contribute to the job creation in the sector? And all of this is, of course, articulated in the key policies in our country, the National Development Plan, Mzansi Golden Economy from 2011, and of course, recently the revised white paper on arts, culture, and heritage that I was talking about. And what is also very much encouraging is that, a lot of research has been conducted in South Africa and globally as well that has demonstrated that the CCIs, they contribute, from an economic point of view, the number of jobs that the sector creates, the multiplier effect, the GDP contribution. You might be aware that the NFVF, I'm not sure if the study has been completed, but they are, currently conducting an economic impact that, focuses on measuring the impact of COVID-19 on the sector. And some of the, the key economic indicators that they will be looking at is the number of jobs, multiplier effect, and the GDP contribution that I was talking about. And UNESCO just completed, research on the African continent. They have presented preliminary findings. They are only going to be launching the final findings in September. So be on the lookout for that, because that is very important for us within the, African continent as emerging economies, because it is important for as part of, economic recovery post-COVID-19. And I'm going to talk to that later on in my slides. So to continue in the same vein, one of the reasons why you do what you do as content creators is that the CCI enable you your artistic and cultural expression. Most importantly, from a business point of view, it enables the exchange of ideas and the flow of trade and the flow and trade in cultural goods and services globally. So you will notice throughout my presentation that I have highlighted certain words in bold because these are important for the IP and copyright discussion that we're having today. So as I said earlier on, most governments recognize that, part of their post-COVID-19 recovery strategy is going to include the CCIs in terms of, how to get, the industry working again. You would know as well that, this pandemic has been devastating on our sector. A lot of people have lost their production companies. A lot of people had projects in the pipeline canceled because of the uncertainty that was brought about by, COVID-19. There were people who had international productions lined up that had to be canceled, implications in terms of some of the investors pulling out because, everybody was just trying to reassess where they are financially because of this pandemic that none of us knew was going to happen. More so, the scale of the impact it was going to have on our day-to-day lives, on our health, on our livelihood, and on our businesses. So one of the things that I find encouraging is that even though the pandemic has been devastating, there's certain things that we can take away from observations or some of the trends that have come out of that. And one of that is the continuous acknowledgement of the importance of this sector from a government point of view for economic recovery. So, for example, here in South Africa, if you have time, please look this up. The ANC published a document late last year titled Reconstruction, Growth and Transformation, Building a New Inclusive Economy discussion paper. And they identify the CCIs as one of the sectors for priority intervention. So consistency from government side of things. We know going forward that despite all the challenges that our government is dealing with, they are still going to prioritize this sector, and that the interventions will come in different ways, including, funding and so forth. So when you have time, please look this up. It's a very important, document because, once again, policy consistency from the side of government. So then, with that context in mind, let's talk about IP or copyright protection for audiovisual works in South Africa. So our legislative framework is very clear. The Copyright Act of 1978, the Performance Protection Act of 1967, and the Cinematograph Films of Act of 1977. So I think we are all in agreement about the fact that all these acts were, put in place before 1994, before the digital, age. So to a large extent, they are outdated, which is why it's very encouraging that, the Copyright Act and the Performance Protection Act are currently under review. I will talk to that in my next slide. So just to highlight that cinematographic films and broadcasts are eligible for copyright. What I would like to highlight is that ideas are not eligible for copyright. So I have heard a lot of people or a lot of content creators talk about, that reality show on TV was my idea. That program on SABC1 was my idea. And sometimes you want to be, you want to listen, and you also want to advise at the same time to say, as unfortunate as it might seem, unfortunately, your idea is just that, it's an idea. I have 10 ideas a day. None of them probably come to fruition. I mean, think about some of the ideas you've thought of in terms of some of the content that you want to put together for your company, some of the ideas that you would like to collaborate with other filmmakers. So ideas are not eligible for copyright because that's what they are. They are just ideas. Unless you translate that idea into something that is tangible, something that we can put value to, unfortunately, that's all it is, an idea. So moving on to copyright in South Africa. So you will notice that throughout the presentation, I talk about IP and I talk about copyright interchangeably, and I will get to that, in the next couple of slides. So when we talk about copyright, this is the exclusive right which embodies intellectual content to do or to authorize others to perform, reproduce, or exploit, which means selling their work for personal gain or profit. And I'd like us to pause here for a little bit because, as I said, I've highlighted certain keywords that I would like us to talk about. So profit. Some of you have been in situations where you either had to explain to your families, you either have to explain to investors why they must invest in your company or they must invest in your productions. So the conversation around profit is important because if you're having a conversation with investors, for example, they are interested in, returns on their investment. And obviously, then we're talking about profits. And some of you, depending on the type of films that you've made, the type of investors that you've heard, you would know about, the recoupment clauses that come with the funds that you are able to raise from the different investors that you approach from time to time. So I think if we can go back to what copyright means, you can see that the whole notion around, oh, someone has stolen my idea is not really feasible, because, what is there to be performed in that idea of yours? What is there to be reproduced in that idea of yours? What is there to be exploited in that idea of yours? So very important just to be, mindful about, some of the conversations you have, especially around the whole concept of ideas and all that. And of course, there's a related rights in copyright that also includes the right of performers and broadcasting organizations. So from a performance point of view, the music that goes into your films, the performances by the various actors into the, towards the films that you make. So very important, not to lose sight of the objective to make a profit, which is linked to the whole economic value that I was talking to earlier on in the presentation. And then quickly on the slide, then practically, how do you protect your copyright how do you protect your work, your audiovisual work in South Africa? So I've given you just high level what the legislative framework looks like, and also just pointed out, of course, the fact that this is outdated. Some of these are, much older than probably most of us here. So then how do you then go about protecting your work? So some of you work on concepts, some of you have scripts with characters, plots, dialogues, and that is important work for you to be able to protect, so that you can prove that you are the owner of that work. So you can go and register that with the CIPC. They've been doing workshops for the past 5-6 years around helping, content creators to protect their work. And organizations such as the Writers Guild of South Africa can also help you with that, to make sure that you can prove that you own, you are the writer, or you own that concept that you've been working on. And recently, some of you have been required in one form or the other to have a proof of concept. So for example, if you're working on a TV series or a web series, you have to have that proof of concept to be able to raise funds for you to work on that, the full series. And that is what investors will be looking for example. So that is something that you would have to prove that you have that concept that we were talking about earlier on. And it's important for you to make sure that all that work has been registered, so that you can prove that you own the copyright in that work. And I think something else that is very important is to also be familiar with the funding and the distribution terms. These impact on the IP or the copyright. So for example, if you're going to be approaching the DTIC, rebate for the rebates on film and TV, they're very specific around the IP ownership that you must have for you to be able to qualify, for example. And some of your licensing agreements, whether they are exclusive or non-exclusive, will also talk to some of this, this aspects of, IP copyright, and you need to be familiar with those as well. And also the broadcaster's terms for commissions. So commissioned work, for example, either ETV or SABC would, they would put out those calls for proposal, where you have to, put together a proposal. Within those RFPs, they will indicate, the issue of copyright. And I think the history here in South Africa has always been that, I'm sure some of you might be familiar with this phrase, he who pays owns. So if you're going to be, producing commissioned work for broadcasters, they will take all the IP in perpetuity across all platforms, known and unknown. And we know what that means. So you get paid off that once-off fee, and you will not get to benefit out of future exploitation in other platforms outside television. So the important thing is that, you need to be able to negotiate some of these things. We know that sometimes with the SABC, for example, you can do those unsolicited proposals where, depending on whether it's content that fits into their strategy, you are then able to maybe negotiate better deals for yourselves. And if you are fortunate, you are able to retain some of the IP, especially for territories where SABC is not operating, and also for platforms such as online, which is something that you can always negotiate. But most importantly, don't send your work to people outside contractual agreements. I've heard so many times someone say that, oh, I actually emailed my script, or I emailed some of my work to this person. And then a couple of years down the line, you're watching TV, and there you go. That script that you sent to somebody without the benefit of a contract, a non-disclosure agreement, you find yourself, in a worse off position, because, there is no contractual agreement, and it's work that you just sent to people who did not even request that, people that you don't even have a working relationship with, where ordinarily you would have a contractual agreement that would set out the nature of the relationship with that individual. And then I'm going to go through this quite quickly. So what are some of the challenges? So hindrances to the exploitation of economic rights. So piracy, I think we all know how piracy has literally, destroyed the DVD market. The bootleg copies that the FP, the Film and Publication Board, is consistently banning and destroying, and it still continues in one form or the other, And then we also know about the outdated, unfair contracts, within our space, the broadcaster commissioning practices that I was talking about, once again, that will take away all the IP economic rights in perpetuity and across all platforms, known and unknown. So, for example, if you had done a deal, say 10 years ago with a broadcaster, at the time, they only focused on broadcasting rights because that's where they operate. You had, plans maybe to show your work online and that. So you would not even be able to do that today, because you would have been locked up in a contract like that doesn't allow you to be able to exploit any of your work in other platforms. And as I said, the outdated legislative framework, for example, the Copyright Amendment Bill and the Performance Protection Amendment Bill, very much welcome, because they aim to introduce new changes, such as taking into account the digitization that we're all experiencing in one form or the other, and then the payment of royalties for actors, repeat fees. So with all that said, of course...
Sorry, can I interrupt you? Usipho Ndebele says that legislation is a stumbling block to the creative industry. And I just wanted to quickly pick your brain on that before you move forward.
Yes, so Sipho is correct. I mean, there's a lot we can talk about in terms of the legislation. So as I said, I've spoken about how the Copyright, Act in its current state, allows for broadcasters to retain all rights. So we know that doesn't work for producers, because then it just means that all you do is work for producer fees, and you lose out on the opportunity to be able to, to share in the profit of, the exploitation of this content on other platforms. And we know that, broadcasters are also utilizing, online platforms and all that. But, it is definitely a stumbling block. And, even though there's been quite a lot of work in terms of trying to, to update the legislation. There's still a lot of debate. There's still a lot of areas that are contested. And currently, the president has not signed those bills because there's issues around fair use. There's also issues around, copyright owners that are aggrieved that if the changes that have been included in the copyright amendment bill go ahead, they are going to lose out on some of the economic benefits that they were entitled to before, the bill, before the bill was in place. So he is right, and I'm happy to have a further conversation about that so that I can just then talk about the opportunities and specifically focusing on, the exploitation, the monetization of content by creators. So I think we are all aware about the ongoing digital revolution, and it has really, reduced so many barriers for entry, specifically for content makers, because, you are able to use your camera, you are able to use, cheaper, means of production for you to be able to tell the kind of stories that you want to tell. But also, it also allows you to be able to sell content directly to consumers. And this has been enabled mainly by, the advent of social networks, Facebook, YouTube. You would have seen the growing numbers of Facebook in South Africa, YouTube in South Africa, and the opportunity for you to be able to earn advertising revenue in the work that you are creating specifically for consumption online. And some of the opportunities or some of the benefits, of course, is the fact that some of these companies have, IP protection policies. For example, just to be aware of the IP takedown policies on YouTube. So you need to make sure that if you're going to be uploading your content there, you actually own that content, because if somebody complains, then you're going to find yourself in a situation where that content is going to be taken down. And of course, there are new revenue streams for exploitation, selling of contract. And this has been necessitated by, the changes in the distribution strategies. As I said, piracy has really been one of those, sad realities of our sector where, like I said, the DVD market suffering huge losses because of that. We've heard of, signal theft. And also, the fact that, there's a lot of, change in consumer behavior that is also driven by technology. So there is that continuous opportunity for yourselves as content creators to not go the traditional media route to try and get a broadcasting deal, because maybe the type of content and the the target audience are not necessarily on those platforms, or they are moving away from those platforms. And the new distribution models, we all know about the self-distribution, the bioscopes in townships and rural areas. As I said, these are all informed by, target audience needs, the ability to reach those audiences, and sometimes, broadcaster, channel strategies such as Mzansi low budget films, and also the changing terms of trade. So like I said, the contractual terms between content creators and broadcasters and the streamers as well, that are mutually beneficiary. I think we've come a long way from business practices where, broadcasters would just take away all these rights. There's been a lot of advocacy that has been done. There's been quite a lot of discussion. And I think, some of the broadcasters have come on board in trying to negotiate with content creators, to put you in a space where you are also able to get some economic benefit. I've seen some of the, commission contracts where, you no longer give up all the rights, but, you might retain, DVD rights, for example, especially for low budget films and stuff. So it will be up to you as a content creator to see what economic value you can derive out of that. And I think just to conclude here, the digital revolution is a big opportunity, especially within the African continent. UNESCO, like I said, the UNESCO research that I was talking about, earlier on, one of the growing trends obviously is the uptake of digitization, content creation for the digital market and all that. And one of the things that all of us have learned out of COVID-19 is that because we were restricted in terms of movement, we have seen what that has done to the cinema business. We have seen what that has done to, broadcasters as well, because, your audiences are also online. They are looking for new work. They are looking for new content. So what that means is that, you have a space where you can, reach your audiences directly. You can sell your work, and you can have that ad revenue that is important. But what that also requires from you as a content creator is to make sure that you know the IP and the copyright provisions in the contracts that you sign with the investors, making sure that you don't give away all your rights, especially in the commissioned work environment. And you also make sure that, if it's a licensing deal, is it exclusive? Is it non-exclusive? If it's exclusive, then it means that you're going to be locked down in that 5-year exclusive deal. And what about, other broadcasters that might be interested in your content, for example? So just to make sure that all the time you are mindful around, those contracts that you sign, to make sure that you are not worse off just because you've accepted one deal over the other, so that you leave, the opportunity for you to be able to secure other, distribution deals on other platforms, such as, the content streamers, your Netflix and so forth. But I think my parting shot would be, if in doubt, and if it's really complicated and there's a lot of money involved, or there's a lot of issues that you're not comfortable about, seek legal advice, and I know it's not cheap, but, there are people who have been in similar, situations. There are industry organizations that you can belong to, the SASFERs, the IPOs and so forth, that can help you. Some of them might have relationships with, experts in the industry who focus on negotiating, distribution deals, who put together inter-party agreements between your various funders, those recruitment agreements, so that you don't find yourself in a position where you are not getting the possible maximum, benefit for your work and for your IP. And, so I know it's not cheap, but if you're in a position to be able to fundraise and get a decent budget, make sure that you make an allowance for legal fees in your budget, so that you get those copyright IP related issues taken care of, and you don't lose out on things that would ordinarily, be something that you should be entitled to. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions, to have your comments. Some of you have been producing content in the space, so you have first-hand experience in terms of the contracts that you've been signing, some of the shifts that have been happening in the industry. I find that, it's very encouraging that, most of the big broadcasters are now open to, co-productions. They are now open to licensing deals instead of those commissions where content producers are the biggest losers. So there's a lot that's happening from a, I guess it's not something that is driven by government or by law, but I think because the sector is consistently evolving, there's a lot more conversations around, fair terms of trade And that doesn't only apply to you, it also applies to the talent. It also applies to the other people who contribute to your work, And with more and more collaborations taking place within the continent and all that, it will also require all of us to be familiar with the IP and copyright, regimes in the other, continent, in the other countries in the continent. We also have to be mindful of some of the treaties that South Africa has signed, the WIPO framework, the Marrakesh Treaty that you're creating is also accessible to people with disabilities, for example. So there's a lot to talk about. I would like to pause here and then we can have a discussion. Thank you so much for listening.
All right. Thank you very much, Ms. Makwanya. I definitely gained a lot from your presentation. It was, opened my eyes to a lot of things that I was not aware of, even though I do fancy myself as a bit of someone who has an idea what is happening in the licensing, and intellectual property space. Can I also just remind everyone who's tuning in right now to write their questions in the chat box, and then we can get to them one at a time. And so far, I do have one question for you. And so someone wants to know, does shortening the licensing period reduce revenue? And so if they opt to license for their movie for 3 years instead of 5 years, does it mean the broadcaster will then reduce the revenue that would have been generated that they had agreed on to 5 years?
Yeah, that's an important question. And to be frank, it depends. And I don't have a yes or no answer because the licensing deal that you would sign, for example, would have been based on a number of assumptions and number of deliverables. So, for example, if let's say we're talking about Mzansi, for example, there's a decision that informs which Mzansi channel you go to. So, LSM, the type of audience ratings that you will be required to deliver on and so forth. So I think most of the licensing deals, are usually 5 years. So if it were to be reduced to 3 years, I think you have to have a conversation around how does then that impact your license fee, right? So the license fee that you have negotiated with the broadcaster, I'm assuming that they probably will give a lower license fee, just purely on the basis that it's 3 years instead of 5 years. So I think it's one of those of, you have to talk about it and negotiate around, okay, if we have deliverables as content creators around, audience ratings and those kind of things, then how does that impact on what we get out of that license, for example? And I'm assuming that is not a case where the contract was in place already for 5 years and it was reduced to 3 years because maybe there was a change of strategy for channel, or the content was just not performing according to what was agreed upon, So it's I think there could be people who have maybe more experience on that, but I'm not sure, to be honest. I think it's one of those, once again, if there's a conversation around reducing your license deal from what was initially agreed on, then just have a conversation around how will then that impact on your bottom line and what you were expecting to get out of that licensing deal, because there are benchmarks that most of you would be familiar with in terms of what Netflix would pay for a license, what SABC would pay for a license, what ETV and Mzansi would pay for. So I think it's one of those where, you would have to have a frank conversation around how that would affect you negatively so from the possibilities of what you could be getting out of that license deal.
All right. And now another question that we have is that there's a rumor that the new copyright law will mean content will be state-owned. Is there any truth to this?
Okay, so it's not a rumor. So the Copyright Amendment Bill has been a center of debate, and one of the key issues around that is the ownership of commissioned work. So I remember in one of the consultations that we attended, I think it was 2018, the DTI was presenting around why ownership for commissioned work has to vest with the state. And one of the discussions that came to the fore at that time was practical implications for filmmakers in terms of, films that are funded by the state. And we have to go back to the reality that, government to date still remains the biggest investor in films. So I don't know what the percentage split is today, but it's very much close to 50%, if not more. So what that means is that when you go to DTIC for that incentive, when you go to IDC for that loan, when you go to NEF for that cash flowing, when you go to NFVF, when you go to KZN Film Commission, when you go to Gauteng Film Commission, that percentage of their budget counts, it's government. So the conversation was around, does that mean that all the funding that is being channeled towards the sector through these various government institutions that I'm talking about, does that mean then DTIC is going to own part of my film? Does that mean NFVF is going to own part of my film? And at the end of the day, if you revisit your finance plan, most of the finance plan features most of those funders that I just mentioned. So what percentage are you going to be left with? Because the reality is that in most finance plan, it's very rare where you would find that, a production company, a producer is able to put up to 5% of that production budget. The same goes with your private investors. So if you were to combine the percentage that goes to private investors and the government, it means that you will literally be left with nothing, and you are being reduced to the position where you are literally just working for producer fees, and you will not be able to share in the exploitation of the film. So there was a lot of resistance from the sector. I remember specifically, Rihad, I think he was with the IPO at the time, where the industry would not have none of it, because it takes us back so many years. It takes us back to the position where producers are not going to be in a position to own any IP, meaning that they will just be working for producer fees, and that is not sustainable. That is not why we have all these incentives and all these soft funds. The reality, the push and the advocacy has always been around, let's put the producer in a better place where they own IP and they are able to participate in that recoupment waterfall, so that in the event where that films breaks even, where that films make profit, even the producer is in a position to participate and derive some economic benefit out of that exploitation of that film. So,
right.
So the president has referred the bill, both bills, the Copyright Amendment Bill and the Performance Amendment Bill, to the National Assembly. There was a call for comments that closed, I think it was the 19th of June. So let's just keep our ears open to hear what the outcome of those is going to be.
Yeah. So, and then another question, for those who are not familiar with licensing benchmarks, what is one to expect from Netflix or Showmax or Mzansi, etc., etc.? Is it possible to talk about that?
I think I would be happy if there's a few producers in the audience that could share that, because you know how it is. You know, people guard those contracts with their lives, because you know it's always about, if producer X was able to get 250,000 license from Netflix, then why am I not getting the same? So I think the reality is that those benchmarks are determined by the broadcasters. It has to do with their content strategies, and it's very difficult because, in my knowledge and some of the contracts that I've worked in, it depends. It also depends who you are. It also depends on your track record. It also depends on whether you've done previous work for that broadcaster. And, so it's hard to say that there's a fixed benchmark. But if you talk to some of the sales agents like AAA, for example, those are the best people to talk to, because they negotiate those deals, and they would tell you for a fact that with this type of content that you have, if it's a rom-com and we take it to Netflix, we can guarantee you X amount for a license. So I don't want to say things that I will have to retract later, or what I mean. But like I say, there are factors that will determine in one form or the other how much you would be able to get out of that licensing deal. I hope that answers it.
Yeah. And then Anonymous says, I'm going to read this. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I understand it, any image taken of a person is part of their own intellectual property. So for documentary filmmaking, should release forms be signed by every individual that is incidentally been filmed? And if a happy accidental one has filmed someone, but we're unable to get them to sign the release forms, what measures have to be taken? Should it be impossible to obtain a signed release form after shooting? In what case are release forms mandatory, and in what case are they irrelevant?
Sure, that's a tough one, because I think that's also something that you would have to discuss with the broadcasters. But it also depends what are you producing that content for example. So if I follow on that, example of photography, for example, remember what I said earlier on, copyright is for 50 years. So if you are using a photograph that is old and it's more than 50 years, so it's one of those examples where if there's no, you cannot trace who the copyright holder is, and you can use that because that 50-year period would have lapsed, for example. But I think the most important thing is just to make sure that you do what you have to do to get that release form signed, because the broadcasters or whichever platform you choose to distribute your film, like I said, even if it's online on YouTube, there's takedown policies. If I see a picture that you took and I did not, sign that release form for whatever docu you're working on, for whatever reason, I'm gonna send a complaint to YouTube, and we're gonna have a back and forth around a possible takedown of that. So I think it's a conversation around, what is that photography for? Who owns that copyright? And I know that for some, there's a lot of work, especially that has been, produced way back, especially, depending on what it's for, you might not be able to trace the copyright owner, or you just have a difficulty, locating that person for whatever reason. So sometimes, to be on the safe side, is if you can find comparable images that have, copyright owners that can sign those release forms, rather be safe than sorry. Because if you take that decision and say, well, I can't find whatever, then it's gonna be on you. So I don't have a yes or no answer around what are the reasons that are justifiable, because you might be able to justify it yourself between you and the people that you are working with, whether the distributors or whatever. But at the end of the day, if it's not signed for, then you are definitely opening up yourself to, a possible, contravention, whether it was deliberate or not. So I would say in an instance where you can find comparable material in that docky, rather go that route, because look, it's unless you know for a fact that this is no longer, it's no longer, covered by that 50-year, copyright protection that, that is, guaranteed in law. So yeah, it's a lot of work. I've heard people talk about those kind of things, but you rather be safe than find yourself in a situation. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Andile Magwaza says, thank you for a great presentation, Ms. Makwanya. And their question is, if you have licensed your content, but the organization or broadcaster you are in partnership is not delivering on its promises and IP protections, are there any public free organizations focusing in assisting artists copyright reinforcement, or if you need to have your own lawyer to help you out?
Yeah, so I think it also depends. It also depends which organization you belong to. So I know the IPOs and the SASFEDs might be in a position to help you. They do have those relationships with broadcasters and stuff. So it depends. If you're in a position to seek legal advice, I would say seek legal advice, but yep, you can also seek that legal advice through them, where they do have a network of lawyers that might do some pro bono work. Some might be able to assist without charging you an arm and a leg.
All right, we have tons of questions. Unfortunately, we can't get to all of them. Is there anywhere maybe that we can sort of, for more burning questions that could not be answered in the session, that we can go to? If you can give us details for that, please.
Okay, I forgot to put my email address on the on the presentation.
All right.
I think
maybe
my email address
in the chat box.
Yeah, I think, okay, let me write it on the chat box quickly. There you go. So if you have any questions, please drop me an email. I'll be happy to answer those. If I don't have all the answers, I'll be honest. So if I don't know, I will be in a position to refer you to people that would know better.
All right. Well, maybe just one more question in the last 15 seconds. Is copyright renewable after 50 years?
No.
Nope. All right. So thank you very much.
Remember, that 50 years is exclusive. So in that 50 years, you have the exclusive right to sell, to reproduce. So after that, then it means it's no longer exclusive.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ms. Makwanya. Lovely presentation. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. And just for those who will need your email address, it's aifheli@dzanda.co.za. Thank you very much, Ms. Makwanya, and thank you very much to everyone. Goodbye.